We're good? Okay. Good evening. I'm Davis Farmer. I'm the president of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and the folks who are online to join us this evening. And as soon as the folks over there have finished, we'll get a little, we'll get started. As most of you know, we're a not-for-profit and apolitical organization whose mission is to help educate the folks of New Hampshire about events outside of the country that are important to the state and to the United States. We have a fascinating talk this evening, but before I turn it over to our co-sponsor, I'd like to introduce our co-sponsor and bring up Dina, whose last name I'm going to butcher badly, Frutos-Benz, and ask her to just say a few words.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here, and good evening. I am Dina Frutos-Benz. I teach at St. Anselm College, and it is my pleasure to be here representing the Fulbright Association of New Hampshire. And just a few words I want to say, we are very proud to be able to co-sponsor these events. Again, the Fulbright Association is open to students, non-students. I don't want to bore you sort of with all the wonderful programs that Fulbright has, but if you have a chance to check their website, I encourage you to do that. I encourage you to, if you have the opportunity and can try, take advantage of those programs and apply basically for Fulbright. And again, we're very honored to be able to co-sponsor these events, and I'll hand it over to
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming. It's a real honor and a privilege to introduce a great scholar and a great friend of mine, Professor Eric Jensen from Brigham Young University. He's been at Brigham Young for, I think, about 15 years now, and prior to that was at Fordham. But he also served as a career Army officer. He served first as in the Great Branch of Armor, where he became a cavalry officer, served in the regular Army after West Point, and then became a Army Judge Advocate through the FLEP program. And that's where I met Eric when he was serving as a Army Judge Advocate, and I've known him about 20 years. I will say that he was the first person I ever heard mention the concept of cyber warfare, and that was probably about 15 or 20 years ago, and it was just an interesting concept to me of a means and method of warfare in this cyber domain. And he's certainly the most knowledgeable person I know on that topic. Also in this area, he's one of the members, the experts of what's called the Talon Manual, which is the NATO manual governing cyber warfare, and also some issues related to human rights, humanitarian law in the cyber domain. So we're very, very fortunate to have him here with us in New Hampshire. He's a great professor. I know that. The students always love him, and I know he'll enjoy taking your questions. So with no further ado.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us here tonight, both in person and online, and to those who are watching the recording of tonight's event. We really appreciate all of your interest and support in our various programs. I'm very excited for tonight's event. It's a very timely event, and an event that has become even more important and more engaging over the past month or so, as we've seen a rise in attacks emanating from Iran. We'll get into a lot of that stuff in a moment, but I want to, as usual, knowing that we have a diverse audience here of different backgrounds, to do a little level setting with you. Eric, I would love to get your definition. What do we mean when we say cyber warfare? What does that actually look like? What does that actually, how do we experience that in our daily lives?
So that's a really great question, and a great kind of level setter indeed. When I think of cyber warfare, I think of warfare and then cyber operations within the context of warfare. So if you were following this stuff back in the early 2000s, you'll remember hearing warnings about a cyber Pearl Harbor and things like that. And the idea was that cyber tools were going to be used to create on their own, not in conjunction with everything else, but just kind of on their own, going to create this Pearl Harbor event where all the dams would burst and all the airlines would crash and everything would go bad. And I'm not saying that's not doable through cyber means. I'm just saying that that particular warning has never materialized yet. And instead, we're moving much more to what we call integrated cyber military operations, which is the using cyber as a tool to facilitate other military operations. And we've seen that in Venezuela. We see that now in Iran, and I'm happy to talk some more detail about that. So, but the point is, when I think of cyber warfare, I don't think of something uniquely cyber. I think of warfare and the cyber aspects of warfare and how cyber operations and cyber tools fit into that.
And we know that cyber tools are being utilized all of the time, even outside of war zones or conflict between states. So can you talk a little bit about that gray zone in between starting a war and being fully at peace? What are some examples of countries who are probing, who are trying to pre-position some things, we'll say, in the event of a full-blown cyber warfare?
So back when Jeff and I were in the Army, and the U.S. Army was stacked along the border in West Germany, and the Soviet Empire we were there at the Fulda Gap waiting for the Soviet Empire to come across. There were lots of things that were done kind of pre-positioning and maybe even latently during the peacetime before that happened. We were thinking about how we would implant artillery to stop them as they were coming, what we might do to pre-position explosives in bridges and destroy airports and things like that. All of that stuff can be done with cyber tools as well. And so there's a really nice analogy there for those of you who remember those days. There are lots of ways where cyber tools can be pre-positioned in that same way. We think about critical national infrastructure. There could be malware inserted in critical national infrastructure, which would then wait around latently until that might happen. But that's kind of a sidelight. The vast majority of what you're talking about is really just kind of the continuous coming at each other through cyber probing, trying to figure out where your cyber weaknesses are. You all have, your data has probably been stolen by 85 different entities and countries around the world. I know that Jeff and I think the Chinese know more about us than we know about ourselves. Our stuff's been stolen so many times. But and some of that is this continuous probing. And for us lawyers, the interesting thought is, how do you classify those actions with respect to international law? What of those actions are actually unlawful, and what makes them unlawful, and what of those actions are not unlawful? What of them are just unfriendly? And we have a great paradigm under the UN Charter which helps us work all that out, which I'd be happy to lay out in some detail. But so there's a lot that's going on that it goes from the top of the spectrum of war all the way down to just unfriendly acts. And parsing through all of that is one of the reasons I love being an international lawyer doing cyber stuff, because it's really interesting.
So parsing through some of it, can you talk to me a little bit about the difference between cyber attacks, espionage, and other forms of tools or approaches that might help our audience a bit better understand what we're getting at here?
I can, and if I start to go on too long, just stop me and I'll break. But so let me divide kind of that legal paradigm into some categories. I'll start at kind of the top of the most dangerous and move down. When you look at the UN Charter, which is the legal paradigm for the use of force currently, it prohibits something called a use of force, a threat or a use of force, against the territorial integrity or political independence of another nation. And we think of that in kinetic terms as very good analogies. If you launch a missile into someone else's space and blow something up, that's clearly a use of force against someone else's territorial integrity or political independence. But then you ask yourself, well, what is a cyber tool that would be prohibited as a use of force? And when I teach my classes, my students, we spend quite a bit of time talking about this, because you can have very different views. And how even do you conceptualize that? Do you think about the modality? I mean, the reason we think about a missile coming in and doing something and being a use of force is because of the modality, right? It's a kinetic weapon. But cyber tools don't lend themselves so much to that modality analysis. So countries have tended to take an effects analysis on this and to say, all right, well, you're using some cyber tool. I can't just classify every cyber tool as being either a use of force or not. So I'm going to think about what are the effects. So if you're using a cyber tool in such a way that the effects are like a kinetic weapon or like something that we would think of as a use of force, then most nations around the world have agreed that that counts as an unlawful use of force in violation of Article 2, Sub 4, that use of force prohibition. Below that use of force prohibition, though, there are also some unlawful acts that you can do, and we call these mostly, we put them in this big category called prohibited intervention. And again, I'd love to talk more detail about this. When you think prohibited intervention, there are a couple of elements you have to think about. One is coercion, and the other is it's a French term, the domaine reservé. Think of it as inherently governmental functions. If I'm using a cyber tool to coerce a government in things that are inherently governmental, we might think elections, then that is not forceful, so it's not a violation of that part of the UN Charter, but it is in fact still unlawful under international law. And the reason it's important to figure out if it's unlawful or not is because that sets your remedies. When you want to have a remedy, when you want to do something in response, you've got to know what bucket you can dip into of remedies, and those buckets depend on how you classify that initial action. So you've got these uses of force or threats of the use of force, unlawful uses of force. I can respond with force in response to those in most cases. Certainly the U.S. has taken that approach under international law. If it's not a use of force, but instead it's a prohibited intervention, then I can respond with something called a countermeasure, and we can talk more about that if you're interested. And if it's not a prohibited intervention, it's just mean and unfriendly and not nice, well, then we can respond as well to those kind of cyber things like stealing my data and stealing Jeff's data. But we can't respond with the use of force. We can't respond with a countermeasure. We can only respond with what we call retorsion, which means similarly unfriendly acts. And again, we can break all those down into detail as you want.
Yeah, and we'll certainly bring in our audience here in a little bit to see exactly where they would like to take this conversation. But I think the next thing I am interested in is when we are seeing these attacks. We saw several attacks emanating from the United States that actually were designed to deter or prevent attacks. I'm thinking of the 2020 elections. The U.S. Went out and hacked into the Russian computers that were going to be used to try and disrupt our election. What is the viewpoint on sort of preemptive strikes in this space when they are sometimes allowed under international law in the kinetic space?
So this is a really interesting question, and a question that's kind of in flux right now in international law. Everyone agrees that if you know you're about to be attacked with kinetic weapons, you can act anticipatorily. So if Canada's on the north getting ready to march across Niagara, I use that example because it's clearly not going to happen. If that is the case, then the United States could respond anticipatorily if that threat was imminent, leaving no moment of deliberation, no ability to think through, but it was really imminent. Then the United States could act preemptively. We say anticipatorily. And that is true of cyber things as well. If you think that attack is coming, you could act with a cyber response as well. Can I just take a minute and tell a quick aside? So I'm in Singapore. I'm giving this great discussion in Singapore. The crowd is really into it. As soon as I get done, they come rushing up to talk to me. I thought this was a home run presentation. Ends up none of them had been listening to me at all. They'd all been watching the news, and at the time I was speaking, the U.S. had made an announcement saying we reserve the right to respond to kinetic with cyber and to cyber with kinetic. And everybody wanted to talk to me about that. Nobody had even been paying attention to what I'd been saying. But this is a really important point. If you're going to respond either in anticipatory self-defense, you can respond with a cyber tool or with a kinetic tool to a potential cyber attack or a potential kinetic attack. So the U.S. will treat these as the same. So that, I think, that piece of anticipation, being able to do that, is a really key point with respect to cyber operations.
And then before we get into sort of the who, continuing down this conversation of the what, we had David Sanger back in 2018 to talk about this, right in the wake of the NotPetya attack that the Russians had taken, which ended up circling the world, causing something like $18 billion worth of damage, shutting down Masaryk. They couldn't move goods, all of this. We know from examples like that once these attacks are released into the wild, as it were, they can have a mind of their own and come back and bite you, as it happened to the Russian military with this attack as well. So what does the law of international cyber, the Talon Manual, all this stuff say about the intended effect versus the actual effect?
So you have to kind of cut that into two pieces, because there are really two bodies of law that govern that question. One body of law is the law of peace, or the law that you would apply when we're not at war with somebody. And the other body of law is the law that we would apply when we're at war with somebody. And the answers are slightly different in each of those cases. So with respect to the law of peace, so we call this the jus ad bellum. That's, lawyers love legal Latin stuff. We call this the jus ad bellum. With respect to that's happened when you're not at war. Then when you take a cyber action, let's say, for example, as a countermeasure, someone does something unlawful to you and you want to do something back, and so you pick a cyber tool to do something back. International law says that if you guessed wrong and what they did wasn't unlawful initially, but you still responded with an otherwise unlawful response, a countermeasure, then you're strictly liable for the damage that you do in that case. And so that incentivizes you to be very careful with your use of cyber tools in those kinds of circumstances. Now, in armed conflict, so let's say an example of what we were doing in Venezuela, or what we were doing what we're doing right now in Iran, the standard that would apply to the use of cyber tools in that case is just the same as every other tool, meaning that the law says the commander who makes a decision has to, after doing due diligence, has to determine that, not with hindsight, but looking forward, that the potential damage or injury that might come from the use of that cyber tool is not excessive to the military advantage that commander anticipates getting. We call that the principle of proportionality. And so the standard for in armed conflict is a little bit more forgiving on those cyber tools, as it is with other tools, than it is outside of armed conflict.
So I spent the past 2 days with my friend in the back there, Anise, running diplomacy simulations at Portsmouth High School. And one of the things that the students really feel challenged by, especially as the world is reshaping and figuring out new pathways and new approaches to international law, why does any of the international laws out there actually matter? Who's enforcing this? What are the tools that are available? In this space, what does international law actually matter? And why should we care to follow it?
Yeah. I have, I think, what I think is an important answer with respect to that, tied specifically to cyber operations. First of all, I'm a believer in international law, so you have to know my bias. That's where I'm coming from. I'm a believer in international law. I think international law is an important measure by which we interact as an international community. And international law is built by consensus. There's no, edict that lays it down and then has police come and arrest you if you disagree. It's really about states' interactions. But I still think it's really an important point. So that's why I'm kind of an optimist. Now, particularly with respect to cyber operations, my view is that shared resources require legal cooperation. And we can think about that across lots of shared resources. But the cyber domain is a shared resource. When it was built to be free and open. It was designed to allow communication. It was designed not for security, but it was designed for communication and to make communication easy. And there's lots of people who think that may have been an initial flaw, but there are other people who think, no, that's the beauty of the internet, of the global capacity that it brings. But because of that, it's a shared resource. And so from my perspective, I think especially with respect to cyber operations, that shared resource will function better in a cooperative legal environment. And that not only requires the harmonization of domestic laws, which again we can talk about with respect to criminal law, but it also requires international law, a consensus approach to international law. And I mean, I get your skepticism because I think we're probably at an era where we're moving away from legal cooperation across the globe, and I think we can see how that's impacting potential cyber action. So So me as an international optimist, I'm voting for more cooperation internationally, because I think, again, that will make that shared resource more effective for all of us. We'll have more sharing of medicine and all of those great benefits that we get, just communications, global culture, all that. An open and free internet will do all of that better for us if we have a legal paradigm that helps regulate that.
Our online audience is having a bit of trouble hearing you, so just if you could
Sorry.
there you go.
I'll
Okay.
try and do better.
Yeah. No. Our mics are always fun and always a challenge. But so moving away from the what of cyber warfare to the who. Most people, when they think of cyber war, think of the usual suspects: Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, etc. But of course, we know the United States is out there doing cyber operations. We've seen it, as you've already mentioned, a couple of places: Iran, Venezuela, etc. So can you talk a little bit first about the theory and the approach of the United States to cyber warfare? Where are our red lines? What are the things we will do? What are the things we won't do?
I can talk more about the things that we will do than the things that we won't do, because I think the things that we won't do are less clear than the things that we will do. So let me give you some examples just from current operations. I'll take the war paradigm first, and then I'll move out of the war paradigm. So let me just talk a little bit about Venezuela. Let me talk a little bit about Venezuela and Iran. Thank you for reminding me. So there are a couple of key points from Venezuela and Iran that I think lay out pretty clearly how the United States anticipates using cyber operations, at least in the military context in the future. And this goes back to that integrated cyber military operations point that I made earlier. You've all read the news, so I'll just point out a couple of examples. In the attack on Venezuela, there were some very important cyber preparations that took place to facilitate that attack. The key sites that would allow communication amongst the air defense artillery sites that would then potentially pose a hazard to U.S. Aircraft, those were all taken out. Their communication capabilities were taken out. In some cases, they were powered down, so they didn't have power to actually execute. Almost all of the handheld devices, whether phone or radio or things like that, the communication, the things that passed those communications were also disabled, so that there was almost a complete lack of communication at the sites where the U.S. Military was going to be interacting. Those are examples of using cyber tools, of showing what we are willing to do. Now, that was targeted at military assets, but it clearly had an impact on civilian assets as well, right? When you cut out the power to half of a city, that's not just the military that's impacted, it's also the civilians who are there. And I don't know this, but had I been providing legal advice, I would have cautioned the United States to say, well, what other services are you cutting off when you do that? And do those services, particularly if they're emergency services, have backup generators, and have the backup generators been fueled and maintenance? I mean, how much intelligence can we gather to say that we always want to minimize the impact on the civilian population? Sometimes you can't, and sometimes the operation you want to do is so important that you have to accept that there's going to be some influence and some impact on the civilian population. But certainly you would try and do that as well, right? Let me give you another example. In the Iran, we know in the Iran military operation that's currently ongoing, hacking into certain street cameras were able to provide us information on where particular Iranian leadership people were at particular times. Again, that's something that you couldn't do without cyber assets, right? There's no other way to gather that intel really effectively and timely except for these cyber assets. So clearly the United States is willing to do that kind of stuff. Also, maybe less of a preparation thing, but more of when you're actually in the fight. You might think of that in two ways. You might think of cyber targets, cyber assets that our adversaries might have that we might be willing to target. There's lots of those. Communication systems these days are completely built around cyber capabilities. When Russia invaded Ukraine, right before they did, they took out the Viasat ground satellite system. That meant that the people in France couldn't watch Netflix, but it also meant that the Ukrainian military had a harder time talking to each other. And the United States did similar things in several of the operations that we've done recently, taking out those communications. So we're willing to do that. Again, those have impacts on civilians, but you have to weigh, is the impact on civilians worth the military advantage that we're going to get by doing that? We've seen other cyber things lately. I mean, you know the cyber impact on the rescue of the downed American pilot. There were clearly some cyber aspects that facilitated that rescue. Many of the targets that have been hit in Iran have been developed with the use of cyber tools that are helping to verify those targets to make sure they're legitimate targets. So in that sense, cyber has become very much a thing that we are willing to do. Again, I can't speak as much to what we're not willing to do. I think we have to keep our eyes open for that, but those are at least some things that we're willing to do. Now, do you want me to keep going?
You can. Yeah.
Okay. So let me transition away from war and talk about that. This is a really important part of U.S. policy, and if you're following this, you'll know that President Trump just issued his cyber strategy last month. Much shorter than previous cyber strategies, and takes a bit of a different slant than previous cyber strategies written by the past presidents, including President Trump when he was in his first presidency. But the United States has clearly taken the approach that we cannot defend the United States sufficiently at our own territorial borders, our own cyber territorial borders. And so the U.S. has adopted an approach of we will be outside our borders conducting cyber operations in your space, in the world space. So we're going to be engaging in testing networks, in seeking out enemies and adversaries and their cyber capabilities. We're going to be in other people's cyber infrastructure doing that, not in our own, because the U.S. approach is you can't defend yourself adequately if you're only stopping stuff at your own border. So we're out there, and that, of course, is a controversial approach, because I think that we could safely conclude that the United States would not be happy if other countries took that view and thought that they could position themselves in our infrastructure to know what we were doing. Nevertheless, our approach is that we can do that, we can do that without violating international law. We can be out there and looking at what you're doing, adversaries, and then help build our defenses based on that. For people who feel very strongly about the principle of sovereignty, for example, that's a hard thing to get around under international law. If sovereignty, if any violation or any meaningful violation of sovereignty equates to a violation of international law, then the United States seems to be pushing that boundary pretty hard and saying, well, we're going to be in your space, and we don't think it's a violation of international law to be there because we're not doing anything really bad. We're just kind of gathering information. I'm going to come to your espionage point in just a second. But we might feel differently, again, if they were doing that to us, right? Now, what about espionage? Is espionage unlawful? And the clear answer under international law is no. There is no international law, none, zero, that makes espionage unlawful. Now, I've got a big caveat for that, which is the fact that espionage is not unlawful does not mean the mode by which you conduct your espionage is unlawful. So if I'm conducting espionage and I want to gather a dossier that Jeff Spears has on his body, I can't kill Jeff and say, well, that was just espionage because now I've got my dossier, so I'm okay. The mode by which I gathered that intelligence, the murder of Jeff Spears, sorry, Jeff. I mean, he's letting me stay at his house. I should be treating him much nicer tonight. The mode by which I did that.
Well, you said he can't kill him, so
okay,
that is nice.
Okay, good. All right. The mode by which I did it is still unlawful, and that is true of cyber effects as well. If the mode by which you gather that intelligence is unlawful, then you can't just say, well, no, but I was doing it for the purpose of espionage, so I'm all okay. The mode is still unlawful, and that's why we've seen any number of Russian agents and Chinese agents who have been indicted for violations of U.S. domestic law through their cyber actions in their attempts to conduct espionage. When they stole mine and Jeff's data, they violated U.S. domestic law, and therefore they could be indicted as criminals for violating that law, even though what they were doing under international law was espionage and not criminal in that way.
You've mentioned Iran a couple of times, and in the cyber national security plan of last year, 2025, the administration identified them as a major player who could cause major disruptions in the U.S. We've seen an increase in attacks coming out of Iran and Iranian-backed groups, the Striker medical equipment company as sort of the biggest one, but nothing that has reached that level of what was expected. Any insights you have on why they haven't gone further at a time that would seem to be the time to fire all you've got at us?
Yeah, so there's a bit of a tipping point in our cyber history, and this happened with the National Defense Authorization Act back in the late 2010s. And that National Defense Authorization Act, Congress said specifically to the United States military, to the Department of Defense, they said, what you can take specific cyber actions against 5 countries, and of course you can guess who those 5 countries are, including Iran, North Korea, right, Russia, China, etc. You can take those 5 countries. You can take specific cyber actions against. And the key point to this is a little bit nuanced, but the key point to this is Congress said to Cyber Command and the military, those are traditional military activities and not intelligence activities. So what that does is that shifts what aspect of Congress oversees them and who has control of them and how free you can be to authorize those kind of activities. That, I believe, was a shift because I don't want to say green light, that's probably too strong, but it gave authority for the Department of Defense to take much more aggressive actions against particularly those 5 named countries, and to maybe not feel constrained either by international or domestic law as much as they had been prior to that National Defense Authorization Act. Now, what is the fallout of that? I think the fallout of that is that the United States Cyber Command and other cyber assets have been much more aggressive and have been able, as you mentioned, to dampen the 2020 election interference, to dampen many of these external efforts with cyber tools. You've read the news enough to know we're still not super successful, right? I mean, we're still being infiltrated by our adversaries, et cetera. But I think that in many cases that ability has been diminished on behalf of other people because we have been much more active and because Congress has told the Department of Defense you can be more active in that area.
And before I bring in the audience questions here, I kind of just want to lightning round Russia and China, although that's a little bit difficult, I know. What are the key things people should be aware of when we're talking about sort of the 2 big players in the field as adversaries to the United States?
They approach, I think they approach their cyber operations in pretty different ways. Russia is much more in your face than China is. China, I think, is much more subtle, although we hear about APTs all the time, these persistent threats. We hear about those all the time, but...
Sorry, APT?
APT is what I can't remember what the A stands for, but the P is persistent threat. What does the A stand for? Advanced persistent threat. Thank you. Someone in the audience, you should come sit in this chair. So advanced persistent threat, they're much more subtle, and I think they're less in your face. Now, that may be just what we perceive because they may have stuff all over in our critical national infrastructure and we just don't know it yet. And so maybe they're as much in our face as the Russians are. But the Russians make no, they're not trying to hide the fact that they're interfering with elections, that they're trying to skew things in their direction. Even when they know they've been found out, right? They will continue to persist in that way. And I don't mean that as a normative statement, good or bad. I just simply mean that as descriptive. I think that we continue to have great cyber capabilities, and I think that we are unlikely in the short term to be overwhelmed by cyber capabilities from either Russia or China. But I think that is something that could change. And we had a discussion earlier about artificial intelligence and about quantum computing and the impacts of artificial intelligence and quantum computing, particularly when teamed with cyber capabilities, I think represents a pretty big risk that may change that paradigm fairly radically.
Okay, so to our online audiences, go to the Slido app. You can click on the QR code or scan it on our website homepage. You can email us at council@wacnh.org. Love to hear from you as well, but also love to hear from our in-person audience for anyone who may have a question for Dr. Jensen.
Easy questions, preferred.
Easy question. I'll give you the microphone.
Mine's not easy, so let's
No, go on, and come on. Bring it. I'll get it. If I don't know it, I'll ask Jeff.
This one's it. So, my name's Ben Fabergé. I'm a retired Army, former U.S. cyber operator.
Oh, great.
Yeah. So, tracking everything you said, I appreciate you coming out and kind of giving these insights, and it's super helpful to have a forum like this and be able to talk strategically about cyber warfare. Especially, I'm a Granite Stater, so I love being here and seeing this topic.
Nice.
So I'm going to ask you a hard question because you mentioned what cyberspace is as a battlefield, right? It's very asymmetric, right? Everyone it's public, it's open. A tank in cyberspace, let's use this analogy, is not a vehicle that belongs to you, right? It's something that is out there in cyberspace. It may not belong to you under international law. It's not just a tool. It might be a system somewhere else, right? So everyone wages this cyber warfare against each other. But in order for you to build that cyber tank, you almost have to break international law, whether you like it or not, any country, in order to build that cyber tank. Now, in today's age, we have adversaries that are building tanks at asymmetric rates, right? China, for example, owns half the world's infrastructure, probably, either overtly or covertly, right? Everyone's racing to catch up and be able to wage cyber warfare. What are your thoughts? Because you're an optimist, right? You said
I am an
I would
optimist.
love to. I'd love to hear this.
You sound like you're not an optimist.
Unfortunately, 24 years in the Army. No, but I love the perspective, right?
Mm.
And I was at the pointy tip of the spear, so I was an offensive operator. So now I'm a CEO of a company, and I do the opposite. I do defense. I made a mousetrap that finds me on the wire, right? But because this topic is super important, and I'm putting it out there, so you can give some of that optimistic insight, because what you described is basically what makes our country different. I was constrained by rules of engagement that would minimize the damage when we'd go out and maybe break international law, right, to defend our interests and basically win wars against our adversaries. I would love to hear your feedback, your thought on that fact. The fact is, when you wage cyber war, overtly you could say, I'm gonna follow this rule of engagement. Hey, NATO, let's work together. We're gonna follow these rules. But in the background, you have to build that tank. You kind of have to break the law, right? So anyway, leave it up to you. That's my question. What do you think about that kind of nuance?
It's a great question, and I appreciate your experience, and thank you for your service, because we probably wouldn't be where we are with our cyber protections had you not been doing what you were doing. So thank you. So you say break international law. I prefer to say bend international law, but obviously I get your point. I think that's one of the things that is unique about cyber, because as you point out, and as I've mentioned before, you can't adequately defend yourself by being within your own territory. You have to be out there putting together that cyber tank as such to do it. Now, how do I think that fits into international law? I talked about the perspective on sovereignty, and that if you are a really strong believer in sovereignty, then you think that that kind of U.S. program is violating international law. Well, there are some countries out there who take a more broad approach. The United Kingdom is one of them that's been quite active in saying a violation of sovereignty with cyber means is not a violation of international law unless it rises to this level of coercion with respect to domain reserve, which I think most U.S. actions wouldn't do. The U.S. has not expressed an open view on that, although, again, if you track what the U.S. is doing, you might come to some conclusions about their view on that. But of the 30-some-odd nations who have expressed a view, the vast majority of them have taken this view of a very restrictive view of sovereignty. And so that would mean that the U.S. was out breaking international law. Now, there are some people who argue that they take that view with respect to their own borders, but don't take that view with respect to everybody else's borders, right? I mean, so it's kind of like having your cake and eating it too, right? You can't invade my sovereignty. That's a violation of international law. But for me to feel safe, I have to be in your network, so I'm going to be out there doing it. And it may be that that's where states come down on. Because international law is a consensus regime, that we have to figure out what states are saying and what they're thinking. I think the answer, the actual answer to your question is unclear. There are not enough states who have taken actions. There are not enough states who have spoken to say whether or not the U.S. approach to being outside our territorial borders is in fact a violation of international law. We know that if being outside our borders amounts to a use of force in violation of the UN Charter, that's illegal. We know if it is coercive against the domain reservation, that's unlawful. But if all we're doing is we're sitting out there and looking at what's going on and preparing ourselves to take actions as necessary, and even maybe blocking actions that might be coming, but doing it in a way that is not coercive on the government of the territory where the servers sit that we're going to weigh in on, then I think we can make an argument that that's not a violation of international law and that that might in the end produce a safer world. But I go back to the idea that shared resources are better with cooperation with respect to legal aspects. In the Eric Jensen ideal world of the optimist, we would work together to find ways where we could limit that need for doing that kind of stuff. And I have some ideas which I'm happy to share, but I think that's the ideal world of international law. But I really appreciate your comment and your realism. Thank you.
Yeah, Peter, can you come on up?
A cyber tank. Oh, so he used the term cyber tank. It's like taking the imagery of what a tank is in the kinetic world and thinking about it in the cyber world. So really, it's like a cyber piece of malware or a cyber tool that will accomplish a similar effect as to what a tank might do on a battlefield. Yeah, yeah. Unless you've watched Tron, the movie Tron has cyber tanks in it. But other than that, I think that's the closest you get to. Go ahead, Peter. Sorry.
No problem. Thank you so much. I was just wondering, with all the current developments in AI, how has AI impacted the cyber warfare and the overall battlefield? And what can U.S. military leaders do to protect their troops from offensive cyber operations conducted by the enemy?
So there is obviously a very strong connection between artificial intelligence and cyber capabilities. And we talk a lot about cyber AI teaming because the cyber tool is often the vehicle which allows the artificial intelligence to accomplish its task, right? Those things are often done over cyber networks, through cyber means, using cyber tools, etc. So I think they're inextricably connected. How do we protect ourselves from that stuff? Well, that's again a similar question there to your question. There are ways to do that attack the cyber aspect of cyber AI teaming, and there are ways to do that that attack the AI aspects of AI and cyber teaming. If the AI can't communicate unless it is a non-supervised AI, an autonomous AI, if the AI can't communicate, if you can sever its cyber link, then that's one way to make it ineffective, right? Now, if you've got a cyber tool that is built to not communicate, then of course you have to interrupt the cyber aspects of that much earlier, either by getting into the training data set that's training the AI so that it won't do what it thinks it's going to do, or by putting some other command that will overcome the AI's autonomous rules, or by just knocking the AI tool down because it doesn't have power, doesn't have electricity, or can't fly anymore. Those are also effective ways to do it. But with respect to cyber, there are some ways you can get to the AI stuff. We have talked at various points, not necessarily the government has had these discussions, but people in the government have had these discussions about what you can do with an AI data set, how you would classify poisoning, for example, an AI data set in its process. If you can poison the AI data set, then that throws the whole AI tool into disrepute. You don't even have to poison it, I think. I think if you just get access to it, then you have already put enough concern about the veracity of that AI data set that you've already knocked it out of really being useful. Think about it this way. I do not suggest this course of action. I want to be clear about that. I do not suggest it's actually an unlawful course of action, but it at least illustrates the point. Let's just assume that you are facing an enemy and the casualties are high, and you know that they're using a lot of blood. If you can just penetrate the data set, the database where they keep all of everybody's typed blood, you don't have to change a thing. You just have to show that you got into it. And then that data set is completely unreliable and they're going to have to retype everybody's blood before they give them blood. Again, I do not, that is totally unlawful. Do not think that Eric Talbot Jensen thinks that's lawful, totally unlawful, but it illustrates the point, right? All you have to do is you have to cast doubt on the veracity of that system. And you can do that in any number of ways through cyber tools, and that is one way at least to break that AI cyber teaming effectively simply by intruding into the system. Does that answer the question, Peter? It's fine with me. That was a great question.
Thank you. With regards to the sociological impact on civilian infrastructure, does the U.S. law care about that? And if so, what's the impact?
Okay, so that's again asking me what does the U.S. care about, and I'm not very good at answering that question, but I can tell you what international law says. So there have been a number of international and transnational organizations that have talked quite a bit about critical national infrastructure. The UN Group of Government Experts, it started in the mid-2000s and continued until almost 2020. The OEWG, it's another working group that was started by Russia and some of its friends to pick up where the UNGG left off. They talked about this as well. Now the Permanent Mechanism, which is the following. So we had 3 separate transnational, international, UN-centered organizations. One of the few things they could all agree on was that critical national infrastructure was off limits for cyber attacks. However, if you look across the world and things that are going on, there seems to be quite a bit of focus on critical national infrastructure with respect to cyber attacks. So this might be one of those times where it appears international law is solidifying around a norm that critical national infrastructure is unattackable by cyber means, and yet states are routinely conducting cyber attacks against critical national infrastructure. For us, I think that should put us on notice. I don't think we can, this is one of those areas where if you rely on international law, you accept some risk. And you want international law to be on your side. You want to be able to argue that whoever does it is a violator of international law. But I don't think you can say, oh, there's international law about that. No one's ever going to do that. I think that would be an unwise position to take.
And to follow on to that, we have a good question here. Are we, the U.S., currently doing enough offensive and defensive cyber to feel prepared for a likely future cyber attack?
Yeah, I'm really not qualified to answer that question. I've been out of the government long enough that I don't know what we're doing now. I mean, I can tell you what we were doing 5 years ago. I don't know what we're doing now. But I have confidence in the people who are running the military cyber programs. I know many of them. I have confidence that they are absolutely committed to the security of the United States and United States interests. So I believe that we're doing all we can, and I mean, I don't go to bed at night worrying that the United States is not doing all it can to protect its citizenry and its assets and interests. I don't worry about that. Now, how effective that is, but sometimes that's out of control, right? I mean, science is what science is, but I have no concerns that we're not doing all we can and all we can do.
Okay, we got another question here from another anonymous source. What specific criteria should determine when a cyber attack justifies a traditional military response?
So this is a great question. You remember my Singapore example, right? So I think the answer to that really focuses on effects. What is the effect you want to get to? If the effect you want to get to is destruction of something, then I think you can just figure out which effect gets which tool gets me that effect the best, a kinetic tool or a cyber tool. And there are things that are done best by cyber and things that are done best by kinetics. Let me just contrast Iran for a moment. There was an experience in Iran around 2010 with respect to their nuclear systems. You might have heard of the term Stuxnet. Stuxnet is what the world kind of named the malware that infiltrated across a couple of air gaps. So those are gaps where you can't just go from digit to digit. There has to be some way to transition that electronic malware over a space where it wouldn't necessarily go. You had to get it past a couple of those air gaps. I'm not going to ask you to comment on this. You may know too much. A couple of those air gaps and actually then spun the centrifuges irrationally such that those nuclear centrifuges were destroyed, 996, I think, of them. The allegation is
that Israel was behind that with the support of the United States. Neither Israel nor the United States has admitted to that officially that they were doing that. But it effectively set back the Iranian nuclear program for some period of time. You compare that with what we did last summer, right, with the bombing campaign and what we're doing now. That is also setting back the Iranian nuclear program for some period of time. Hopefully, somebody who is in the decision-making process is weighing what is the effect we want, and are we best able to accomplish those effects by a cyber tool like Stuxnet or by a kinetic tool like we're using now. Often, cyber tools are harder to get in place, particularly in situations like that where it's so air-gapped and so secure. Sometimes it's a lot easier just to drop a missile or send a JDAM or a Tomahawk missile, something like that. It's a lot easier. But there are other considerations, effect on civilians, et cetera, et cetera. Those are other considerations that you have to take that fit into that equation when you're making that decision. For me, it's an interesting comparison to see how in one case we thought the cyber tool was the right tool, and in another case, we thought the kinetic tool was the right tool. And at some point, maybe 20 years from now, when all this stuff is declassified, hopefully I'll still be alive, and I would love to analyze those two events side by side and figure out what was the rationale, what were the decision makers thinking, why did they decide to use one in one case and one in the other case, because I think that will give us a lot of insight into how the United States government views cyber tools, how effective and when they should and shouldn't use them.
Okay. Rachel is asking, let me just pull this one up. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges of attribution, as specifically AI is making it easier to enter this field?
Okay, so I'm going to be tempted to riff on this for a minute, so you better stop me if I get going too long. Attribution is one of the key aspects of international cyber operations. And the reason attribution is so important is because one of the key aspects of cyber tools is they can provide you some anonymity. Now, I talk with a lot of cyber scientists, physics PhDs, et cetera, and they tell me now that, that you can almost always attribute a cyber action eventually, but you can't always get there in a timely manner. And of course, if you're the victim of that attack, you want to be able to respond in a timely manner, because 9 months later, it doesn't do you much good to say, hey, you remember that thing you did to me 9 months ago? Well, I'm going to get you for that. It just doesn't carry as much oomph as it would if you could do it right away. So I want you to think of attribution in maybe a different way than you're used to. Most people think of attribution as a binary switch. You either are on or off. You either attribute this to someone or you don't. I think that's the wrong way to view attribution. Attribution is really about assigning responsibility for the cyber act, right? Who is responsible for the cyber act? I want you to think about attribution not as a binary switch, but as a spectrum. So what you want to do is you want to assess, given the strength of your attribution along that spectrum, what is the corresponding action I feel I can legitimately take? So if I have absolutely certain attribution, I can take a really powerful response. If I have really poor attribution, I can't take a very strong response. But if I'm pretty sure, but not really sure, but pretty sure, then I can take a pretty sure equivalent in my response, right? I can come back at that person with a pretty strong response. It can't be as strong as if I knew it was them, but I can still do something. So I think if we think of attribution as a spectrum rather than as a binary approach, it will allow us to be more active in our responses. Now, let me riff. Okay, so here is one of the things I think is a key point that we can do better at in international law to help us with this problem. In international environmental law, there is this principle called due diligence. And what it says is, I'm going to use a real case, if Canada has a smelter just across the border from Washington, and it's dumping a bunch of chemicals on all the apples in Washington so that the apples in Washington go bad, then Canada is responsible for the economic harm experienced by the apple orchard owners in Washington. That is a very solid, universally accepted principle in international law, in international environmental law. If you cause some environmental harm to someone else's stuff, you're responsible and you have to pay. You have to pay damages. Everybody agrees with that. But due diligence, that term, is what we call sector specific, meaning it is embraced differently in different aspects of international law. So how does it apply in cyber law? All right, come with me for a minute on this tale. When you look at all the stuff that is going on, particularly stuff that the United States has attributed to other states, it's very seldom the Russian military or the Chinese military or the Iranian military who's doing it. They're using proxies. They're using civilians. And sometimes they're spread out all over the world. They're doing that on purpose because it makes it hard for us to find them. And then when we find them, it's really hard to deal with them because we have to deal with them under criminal law instead of under international law. So if Russia hires a bunch of people living in Moldova, just criminals, to come at some really important U.S. asset, when the U.S. figures that out and wants to stop it, they can stop it using technical means. But when they want to go get those Russian proxies in Moldova, their only opportunity to do that is to pursue them through transnational criminal law, to send information to Moldova and say, look, here are the people in your country who've been doing bad things. Here's all the data. We have an extradition treaty with you. Will you please grab these people up and haul them off to the airport? We'll come pick them up, and then we'll bring them back to the United States and indict them. Now, you can imagine that some countries are more willing to cooperate with U.S. transnational criminal process than others. There are a couple of great treaties out there, the European Cybercrime Convention, which helps. The UN just passed the European Cybercrime Convention, which helps a little bit. But in the vast majority of cases, we will never get the habeas grabus. We'll never be able to put our hands on these people who have done these kinds of things. They just remain indicted. Every once in a while, they decide, I'm going to go vacation in Disney World, and bam, we get them, or something like that. But most of the time, we don't get these people, right? So how can we use international law to fill that gap, to disincentivize states to use proxies? Because right now they're incentivized. There's so little risk for states when they use these civilian proxies, very little risk. How do we disincentivize that? By applying that principle of due diligence that we accept so firmly in international environmental law to cyber law. Here's how it would play out. So Russian hires a bunch of dudes to do this bad thing in Moldova. We know who it is. We know where they're at. We go to Moldova and we say, government of Moldova, here's the information. You can do transnational criminal process if you like. That would be great. We would love to prosecute them. But in the meantime, you, state of Moldova, have a due diligence obligation to prevent that harm from your territory in causing harm in our territory. And if you don't, you're violating international law, and we can pull from some of those international law remedy buckets and come after you. We can take countermeasures against you, state of Moldova, for not controlling the threats that come from your country. And then we can go back to Russia and say the same thing. You're the one that is proxizing, that's not a word, that's turning these people into proxies. We can come after you if you don't stop, because you have a due diligence obligation not to cause harm that's going to affect us. The United States is very hesitant to adopt this due diligence principle, as are many countries around the world. Maybe because it might be used against us. I'm not sure. But the United States is hesitant to do this. If we got states around the world to adopt this cyber due diligence principle, I think it would do a lot to disincentivize this use of cyber proxies, this use of proxies who now aren't controlled as well, and we can't get to them as easily under international law. I riffed on that, sorry.
No,
I'm off my soapbox. I'm standing back down.
That was great. I enjoy the passion that you brought to that.
I do have some passion.
So we have another question here online. You spoke about the pre-positioning and working outside of U.S. borders. We also hear about the pre-positioning of China into our own infrastructure. Can you talk a little bit about the idea of the mutually assured destruction defense use case?
Yeah. So mutual assured destruction, or MAD, a very appropriate acronym. This came out of the nuclear parity in the 1950s and 60s, and the idea was, if we both have if all three of us at some point, but initially if both U.S. and Russia have so many nuclear warheads pointed at each other, it would be mad to go through this mutual assured destruction. If we all launch, we're all dead. What good is that? And so there is some discussion about that in the cyber world, where some people that don't necessarily advocate, but they say it's not as bad as it seems because we're heading towards mutual assured destruction with respect to cyber stuff. everybody's and everybody else's critical national infrastructure. Therefore, no one's going to pull the trigger. No one's going to launch the first nuclear warhead. No one's going to launch the first cyber attack into critical national infrastructure because they know it will set off a chain of events that will lead to everybody having nothing, right, to complete destruction. I think that is a theory. I think, though, the problem where I think that theory breaks down a little bit is because of the precision of cyber tools, it's a little less like mutual assured destruction. The launch of one nuclear warhead almost certainly during that era would have caused massive response strikes, right? You wouldn't have done one for one. But with cyber tools, because they're so discrete, or can be so discrete, you could envision a scenario where you might respond to one particular critical national infrastructure strike with another singular critical national infrastructure strike. You might think in your head, they're just launching that to see if I own them in the same way they own me. If I illustrate I own them in the same way they own me, then we'll just stop. Now, that's a theory. Happily, we've never crossed that brink, but I think that's at least one way to conceive of this differently than the standard nuclear mutual assured destruction.
So I think we've officially scared everyone, but yeah, Jeff.
Oh, so this is not a plant. I didn't give Jeff this question, which makes me very worried about how tough it's going to be.
Easy question. And this kind of goes to the question about the lawfulness of cyber actions. So in the introduction, I mentioned the Talon Manual. I'm an optimistic, positive international lawyer as well. But all of the treaties I've read that govern humanitarian law and human rights law, not a single one of them mentioned the concept of cyber. Mm-hmm. And the last time I looked at my list of authorities, the Talon Manual, very persuasive and very well done, I encourage everybody to read it, is not law. So how do we get from the UN Charter, how do we get from our body of humanitarian law and rules governing the laws of armed conflict to where we have any violation of law at all in the cyber domain? And how would we enforce it, for instance, in an international criminal court?
Yeah. So that is a really good question, Jeff. So one of the reasons we put together the Talon Manual was, there was like 25 to 30 of us, and we don't make law. I mean, good heavens, Jensen does not make international law. That is left to states, right? That's what states do. They make international law. States as in countries. But what was going on, or what wasn't going on, was there wasn't a discussion happening. And so our goal in writing both Talon Manual 1 and Talon Manual 2, Talon Manual 1 dealt just with warfare. Talon Manual 2 was cyber operations more generally. Our goal was not to make law, but it was to say what the 25 of us thought the law was, and myself accepted. The other 24 were super smart, really well prepared people to write this manual, and then to get states talking about it. And we have been effective in that. States who were almost silent, almost completely silent prior to the publication of the Talon Manual, now have begun to speak, sometimes in great quantities, about their views on these things. And if you go to the Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence, the CCD-COE, they track all this. They've got a great library that shows a digital library that shows all of the statements by every state in the world where they have made a statement about what they think about various aspects of the use of cyber operations. So I view the Talon Manual 1 and 2 as super effective, not only in saying what 25 of us thought the law was, but in then making states stand up and say, you got it right or you got it wrong, and here's where you got it wrong, and here's why that's wrong. And now we're getting more aware of what states say and what they're doing. And, you read the news, we're much more aware of what states are doing to each other as well now, and in some cases about whether they think what they're doing is lawful or unlawful. And that, in my view, is the great accomplishment of the Talon Manual. Not that we 25 made this masterful treatise, but that we got states to take notice and say, wow, I think those guys were wrong or those guys were right. I'll just give you one quick example. We have time for a quick example? All right. So one of the things we talked about in the Talon Manual was data and how to treat data. Now, the law says that when you're targeting things in the context of armed conflict, the rules for targeting apply to tangible objects. And so our question was, well, is data a tangible object? If I'm attacking a tangible object, there's a whole list of rules. We call them precautions. I have to verify, I have to apply principle of proportionality, I have to use certain methods, I have to check what weapon system I'm using. All of that applies. Those precautions apply when I'm attacking an object. Well, object under international law is understood to be a tangible thing. Data is non-tangible. When we wrote the Talon Manual, we said data is not an object. So you can attack it without having to apply all of those safeguards. Now, I ask my students this all the time. If I could either have your car or all of your data, which would you give me? And they're like pulling the keys of their car out and putting it on the table. Our data has become so vital to us and the way we live our lives that it's become super important. And states, in response to what we said in the Talon Manual, said, look, you may have gotten it right in the Talon Manual according to what the law is, but we think the law has got to change. We think that data is so important in today's world that it's got to be protected. You have to put it in that same box with those extra protections. And so for me, this is a great example of how the Talon Manuals have helped move the law forward, not because we were super smart, but because we got states talking about what they thought the law should be.
Okay. Any final questions? All right. Well, then I will risk what did not go well in our drone conversation, an attempt to make people feel better. So I promised people who would attend or watch this online that we would give them insights into how they are now on the front lines of this new battlefield. Maybe not so new, but what can people do? What should people do? Or should we just throw up our hands and say, we'll let Jeremy figure it out?
Jeremy, it's all yours. Over to you. I think that I've told you I'm an optimist. So even though I live in this world, I am not discouraged. I don't go to bed at night worrying. I'm an optimist. I think that things will work out okay, especially if we start to treat these shared resources as cooperative legal problems. All right, I'll stop saying that. But what can we do? One of the we were trending better up until let me say it this way. The prior national cybersecurity strategies, all from the last 4 presidents, including President Trump's first presidency, all talked a lot about public-private partnership and how key that was to overall cyber defense. This last cyber strategy is significantly shorter than all the others and doesn't really do much with private-public partnership, which I wish it would have done more, because I wish that was a theme we would continue to hit. I think the thing that we can do, we talk about humans as wetware, so there's software, there's hardware, and there's wetware. Humans are wetware. I don't know why they say wet. Maybe because water, blood, stuff, I'm not sure. But they call us wetware. But wetware, we humans are the weakest link in that cybersecurity piece, right? Because spear phishing and all of these other types of modalities by which access is gained almost always come through some human error or some human link, right? I mean, there are a number of zero-day things out there that give us a chance to needle in without any kind of, but most often access comes through humans. So what can we do? Well, we can just be smarter. We can update our stuff. We can care about cyber defense. We can tell companies that we're invested in or that we work with, look, I'm willing to pay a little bit more if you'll have no kid in a cyber defense that works. I'm willing to vote for legislation that will require companies to do more. I'm willing to encourage companies to work with the government to try and build a better national cyber defense, which must, of necessity, include a private-public partnership. I think those are all things that we can do that I think will put us in a better spot. And ultimately, we are the weakest link. And so we have to be willing to step forward and do more.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking Eric for his time, his insights. Thank you to our audience for joining us here tonight and for watching the recording. Thank you to New Hampshire Fulbright for supporting this. Please stick around, eat our food, drink our drinks, continue the conversation. We always view this as the start of the conversation, not the end of it. We hope that you've enjoyed tonight's discussion. Our next event will be here in the office May 6th. talking about conflict journalism. We have a great speaker who now is our third time's the charm of rescheduling with her, but that's great. We have Jake Sullivan for our global forum on May 14th, and then we'll be announcing shortly our final event in this series, which will be focused on the weaponization of outer space. Fingers crossed for May 27th. So please check out our website. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for your support, and we look forward to seeing you next time.